Welcome to Conversation with Friends. My name is R.O. Smith. This morning we are joined by Pastor Carla and John Leimbach, who we're going to be hearing about in just a second. Conversation with Friends is a place where faith and culture intersect and have a dialogue with each other. That's what we're trying to do. And so this morning we're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, and that is money. So, John, that's why we're bringing you in here. So, John, tell them a little bit about you, who you are, what you did in your previous retired life, what you do now in your retired life.
Well,
and what it has to do with money.
Well, I am an accountant, but I'm not a CPA. And I've done that for many, many years, and I've also been involved in many businesses. I've been the treasurer of the church for the past 25 years. And as an accountant, they figure out they need a treasurer too. So I'm also a treasurer for Genesis International Orphanage Foundation and some other organizations also.
Okay, so what's the difference between an accountant and CPA, just to clarify?
A CPA has, they both have accounting degrees. CPA has passed the California exam, and they have 2 years of auditing experience. I've always worked for corporations, so I'm the person who's being audited by the CPAs.
Got it. So in our culture today, there's a lot of talk about inflation and raising wages and lowering the cost of living, or raising the cost of living, all that kind of stuff. What's going on in the economy? Like, what is inflation? Where does it come from?
Well, inflation is one of those very insidious things. It just eats away. A little inflation is good. The target for the Fed is around 2% a year, and for many, many years.
Wait, pause. Why is a little bit of inflation good?
A little bit of inflation helps increase the economy. Things will generally always go up, and what you hope is that wages are going to go up a little bit more than inflation. And that's exactly what we had pre-COVID, where wages would maybe go up 3% a year and inflation would be maybe 1.5%. So families could then turn that into savings or use it to consume. So it helps the economy. We're in the exact opposite position right now, where inflation is much higher than wage growth. So inflation right now is about 8%. Wage growth is about 5%. So that difference of 3%, you're either not going to spend it or you're going to dip into savings. And that's going to, by dipping into savings, which consumers are doing right now, it's going to reduce your family wealth, net wealth. And if that keeps on going, it erodes your savings, erodes your ability to retire earlier, because your savings are going down and you don't have enough to live on in years ahead.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, so real quick, define inflation exactly? Like, what is it? Like
It's the increase in cost of everything.
Okay.
The basic measure is the Consumer Price Index, and that's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Okay.
And there is overall inflation at 8%, and then there's what they call core inflation, and that is minus energy and food prices, because those are extremely volatile.
Okay.
And so the core is just looking at what's really going on in the economy without these two things, and that's at 6%, which is we haven't seen these rates in 40 years.
So explain why it's so high right now. Like, what is the perfect storm that created this high inflation?
Well, in 2019, our inflation rate, I believe, was about 1.7%, and it had been very, very consistent, right around that 2% the Fed likes to see for many, many years. With COVID, we went into something called the COVID economy, where things just completely changed. First thing we did is we just shut everything down, and which created a lot of problems with unemployment and everything like that. And a lot of that unemployment was people that work at restaurants or everything like it really affected the lower wage earners more than it did the higher wage earners. All the people, the computer programmers and bioscientists and professionals were generally were fine. They just worked at home.
Because there was still a need.
There was still a need for that.
Right.
And so was the question?
The question was, what caused this high inflation?
So the first thing the U.S. did is it pumped trillions and trillions of dollars into the economy. We got stimulus checks. We had the Payment Protection Act. There are all sorts of things that they wanted to keep the economy going, so they just pushed a lot of money into the economy. At that point, you've got a lot of money, and it's searching somewhere to go. So in basic supply and demand, the supply is the same, the demand is more, prices rise. So people, and it changed what we were spending our money on. So for instance, we weren't going to travel, we weren't going to restaurants, so what are we going to do? We're going to buy stuff. You know, we're going to remodel our house, we're going to buy the new dishwasher, refrigerator. So we went from a services-based economy to a product-based economy. And that's not easy to switch. So there was a lack of product out there. And on top of that, you had a lot of factories just shutting down across the world. And especially with microchips. And so it affected production in cars because you couldn't get chips. It affected computers because you couldn't get chips. So you had less product and more demand, prices go up.
So it feels like, I mean, I don't know if most people feel this way, but I think this is the feeling I get out there, is that our money doesn't feel like it's worth very much right now. How do we get out of that? Because it feels like people have more money because of all this stimulus and all this stuff being pumped in, but it's like all of a sudden everything's gone up, even as we have more money. So it feels kind of less value.
So, you know, one of the big issues right now is, we are coming out of a COVID economy. We're returning back to a more normal economy. However, there's this little war in Ukraine. And what that did is, we already had inflation before that. Inflation was on its rise up because all this money coming in the economy. Then, with the war in Ukraine, the price of oil has gone from about $60 a barrel to almost 120. So it's doubled. You know, no need to talk about what it costs to fill up our car any longer. And because of that, we have less money to spend. This is really hard on working class families. They're really struggling to make it. And in San Diego, you need a car to get anywhere. And that money, that extra money you spend, you can no longer spend on food, and it becomes very difficult for families to meet their budgets. Therefore, they're also going, if they have savings, they're going into savings. If they're not, they're sometimes facing some very desperate situations.
So we keep hearing about, I mean, across the country, for good reason, there is a demand for higher wages, particularly for some of these jobs that were shut down during the pandemic that we now understand as sort of essential for our economy. You know, I mean, it's like grocery store workers and, you know, some of these lower paid childcare workers, all those things. But does increasing wages really actually increase value or spending ability? Because it seems like we increase wages, it just increases the product cost.
That is a great point, that that companies, and they had a hard time finding employees, and so what they did, they raised rates to attract employees, but they've got to raise prices.
Right.
So it's very insidious. I mean, you know, once you start doing that, this rises, then this rises, then this rises, and it's really hard to wring inflation out of the economy. The main way is to raise interest rates. The Fed has already raised interest rates this year. They're meeting in 2 weeks. They're going to raise them again. And they're meeting again in September. They're probably going to be increasing them.
Why is that? Does that discourage people from
it
buying
makes
stuff?
it makes everything more expensive.
Right,
it makes your mortgage, you know, real estate prices have just skyrocketed during this time. It makes the cost of buying a house more expensive. So therefore, the price of the house should come down. It makes you're buying a new car more expensive. Cars are shot, you know.
So it's like reining things in.
It's reining things. It's reducing demand. The problem is, do we go into a recession?
Right.
And
what does that mean? What does that mean to go into a recession?
Right.
It means
too high of interest rates.
that I believe the technical meaning is that we've got 2 quarters of negative gross domestic product. The economy is actually contracting. There is less demand. There is less need for workers. There are layoffs. During this time, interest rates go up, unemployment goes up. You're wringing the excesses out of the economy. And our guideline to that was what happened 40 years ago when inflation was just incredibly high. And Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as head of the Fed. And Volcker raised interest rates to the highest point we've ever seen in our lifetime, and probably the history of the United States. And it did crush inflation, but it came at a very high cost. The economy went into a very deep recession. If you remember the whole thing about the Rust Belts, all those factories across the Midwest, the Ohio's, the Michigans, those plants shut down. All those steel mills shut down. All those jobs for kids coming out of high school who really didn't go to college, that was the place where they went, and they were able to make a decent living. Those jobs don't exist any longer.
So this is all making me very anxious. It's making me sweat a little bit, just hearing, because it's such a a balance of things that all need to align. And it's true that our dollar is the sort of, what do you call it, plumb line for the whole world, right? For the global economy. So if we can't get this straightened out, it doesn't just affect us, it affects the whole globe. Is that correct?
I think inflation is global right now, and there's different reasons in different parts of the world why it's that way. It's a little bit different from us than it is in Europe, and don't ask me to explain that one. But we are the key indicator, and we are the strongest economy in the world. And what happens to the United States, recession-wise, will have an effect globally. Because we won't be importing as much from all these different countries, and a lot, from not only China, but from the Vietnams and the other places where we have our goods manufactured.
2 questions. Number one, it was going back to what you said earlier. So you remember like older folks would always say, I remember when you could buy this for a nickel. We don't want to go back to buying stuff for a nickel, do we? We just want to make sure that what we're intake, because if you go back, that means the economy is contracted if like bread costs 10 cents instead of, okay.
We don't want deflation.
We don't want deflation. Okay, got that.
But we want to get back to 2%.
Got it.
And one of the things is also the oil prices, and we're not going to get really back to a good economic base until the oil prices come down to where they should be.
And then secondly, when in our history were we like in the sweet spot, like for a while? Like, because you always feel like in the 80s, you always kind of you heard about inflation. When in our history were we like right in that sweet spot for a long period?
And I think a lot of us have lived through the sweet spots. Certainly after World War II, World War II, there was number one, there was nothing to buy, and so you saved your money. And as soon as the war ended, people were, after 4 years of war, they were ready to spend. So the economy went on a rip-roaring ride that lasted to the 1950s. During our time, after Volcker raised the rates, and then they finally went down. Oil finally went down. We went on a long ride for a good 6-7 years in the 1980s. The same thing happened in the 90s, late 90s. We had a very nice long run. But what happened, we got excesses in the economy, and money started chasing things like the dot-coms, which weren't making any money, but people were throwing their money into them, and the excesses. And one thing a recession does, it brings out the excesses. It gets rid of companies that aren't profitable, that are undercapitalized. By raising interest rates, they can't borrow.
So we've only been in sweet spots for like 5-7 years at a time. Like
That's
there's
the
not
point,
like a
right? It
there's
kind
not
of-
okay. Okay.
That's the point of the economy.
It's
It goes-
it expands, it contracts.
Right.
I mean, during the past 10 years, we were
good.
post the Great Recession, we were in a pretty sweet spot for the economy. We actually had not great growth, but we had very steady growth. But we also didn't have much wages increase.
Right.
The price of oil was pretty so things weren't fantastic, but the unemployment was very low. And people were able to save, put away money for their retirement, not having to spend their excess on gas or food or something like that.
All right, I got 2 more questions. One I'm asking because I'm a pastor. First one, though.
Wait, did we address your anxiety, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, you
Well,
did?
I mean, I think the first question is there anything that we can do as individuals to help with inflation?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
It's all done by the government. We can't.
Well, it's not done. It's the government has certainly some effect in it, but it is a global issue. There's not anything we can really do about oil prices. In my opinion, oil prices are artificially high because of the fear of curtailed supplies.
So it's not a reality that there's curtailed supplies. It's a fear of that.
That is my opinion of it.
That feels
because
that feels dirty. Feels wrong.
the economy really hasn't. Think about it. The economy really hasn't changed that much about the need for oil to drive trucks, for our cars, to power shipping containers and stuff like that. But it's the fear that we won't have the oil. And all of a sudden, there was not a good reason for oil to go supply and demand wise from $60 to $120, other than fear of supply because Russia is now cut off.
That is so interesting that it's because I see this on, I guess online on like CNN Money or one of those sites that you look at stocks, and what's driving the market is extreme fear right now.
Yes.
And how that is something, though, that we as individuals can make decisions not based on that, right?
Yes, we can make. You're absolutely right. We can,
So someone who's feeling anxious
Sorry.
can say, "I'm not going to feel anxious about it."
Yeah, so it's because it's not reality. It's just
right, and it's
totally
kind of like
giving you a
it's
hard time.
give your fears and concerns to Jesus,
Yeah.
Right.
because you can worry about them. There's not much you can do about them.
Right.
yeah. So let's take this back to a biblical perspective.
Speaking of Jesus.
Speaking of Jesus, Jesus obviously talked a lot about money, and he didn't live in a capitalistic society. It's not like that was his worldview. But he certainly talked about, our relationship to money, our relationship to resources. I mean, and that hasn't changed, his perspective, that we are essentially not defined by our resources. On the same note, to go back to that conversation about minimum wage or the increase in wages, like what is a biblical response to caring for people's value in a society, knowing that increasing wages doesn't really change where a person is in life.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? If we increase all the wages, it still just increases. It doesn't change anything. So what would be a biblical response to taking care of or giving people correct wages or valuing people no matter where they are on the spectrum, or what job they're in, I guess?
I'll say a couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind is where are our idols? Is our idol our wealth? Is what we own? Is the toys we own? Or do we go to God for this? Where is the center of our life? Is it bad to make money? Is it bad to be wealthy? To me, that's fine as long as God is in the right place. That God is first. And if you make money, then you can certainly help out other people who don't have money. And to me, that's kind of the biblical thing. We also take care of each other. There are people that struggle out there, the people that need help. Our Ukrainian family that is going to come here, they need help. The orphans in Mexico need help. And that's where I think it comes in biblically to use our resources, our time, talents, and treasures to help other people out, no matter what they are. And we all have those. You know, we all have some sort of talent that we can use to help others.
It's like a communal pot.
It's a communal
that we're called
pot.
to.
And
some of
absolutely.
us bring money to that pot, and some of us bring other things to that pot.
Right.
Awesome. It's been very interesting conversation. I've learned a lot here. Go
I
ahead.
know.
Sorry.
So with all this, so like when you talked about going back to how the U.S. dollar kind of sets the, you know, plumb line for the globe. Recently, we've been hearing about a more decentralized form of currency called Bitcoin. Do you have any idea about that? Do you have any knowledge on that?
I know absolutely nothing.
Okay, so calling all people that know Bitcoin, we want to hear from you because we are clueless, and so we want to know from you what is Bitcoin, because I read stuff and I just don't know enough about it. So if you have it, then let us know. Contact us somehow through our email. But anyway, so thank you, John. Thank you, Carla, for joining us this morning, and thank you for joining us here on Conversations with Friends. If you want, you can go to our website at pointlomachurch.org, and you can follow the banner, click on the banner to go to the page, or you can go to our YouTube page and make sure you like, subscribe, and ring the bell like I like to tell people so you can get notifications on when we put out more content. So thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.